Hello folks, hope you're doing well. Been a bit since I posted something on here, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. While I've mainly focused on landscape photography, street photography, and a little bit of travel stuff on the channel, actually mostly travel stuff, the thing that actually got me into photography in the first place and the reason that I continued to shoot is concert photography. And I thought it'd be an interesting little video to put together here on shooting concerts on Fujifilm, which is not something that is typical of a concert photography shooter. There are very few resources online about Fujifilm concert photography specifically. I think I've seen a couple blog posts, a few Reddit articles, and maybe one or two videos, but generally Fujifilm is not the pick for concert photography. Most concert photographers will go with something like Sony or Canon or Nikon. I'd say the first two more so than the latter. And the reason being is because they're tried and tested. People know that they work, and the autofocus, especially on Sony, is lights out. But I would say that Canon probably dominates that field. My goal with this is twofold. A, I want to showcase a few of my photos from my first year of concert photography where I've taken it somewhat seriously. And second, I also want to have another video to add to the repertoire of Fujifilm concert and video shooters that don't currently exist on YouTube in its current form. So to give some background, after doing some research over the summer of 2023, I came to the decision of purchasing the Fujifilm X-S20, which is what you're seeing this video shot on right now. In the background, you can see my X-H2S, which I've recently upgraded to, also doing a little bit of recording on the side. The reason for picking the X-S20 was that prior I had a Canon M50, which is a great entry-level camera, but it wasn't quite doing everything that I needed it to do. The X-S20 I had seen a few reviews on, and everybody had said that it was a great hybrid camera for a little bit of photography, a little bit of video, shooting open gate 6.2K video and some very high quality photos at 26.1 megapixels. So this initial setup that I had going into shooting concerts and shooting small shows was just a Fujifilm X-S20 and the 18-55 kit lens, which is hidden somewhere back there. Now, the thing about the kit lens, while it is fantastic, it is a f2.8 to 4, which means that at its longest at 55 millimeters, which is about a 70 millimeter equivalent, maybe a little bit more, you can only shoot f4, so that's the lowest aperture that you can have, which for concert photography is quite limiting, especially in the settings that I found myself in.
This is
So my first endeavor into finding opportunities to shoot, I've been lucky enough to have made connections over the years playing in a local band where I know quite a few artists that I can reach out to and ask to come to their shows, and that's exactly what I did. I had no formal experience with concert photography. I didn't really have many photography connections, and so everything that I was doing was purely based off of music connections that I already had established. Admittedly, I had very little right to be out at these shows. The acts that I was covering and that I was able to go out for are artists that are getting pretty big, Robin Ottolini and Owen Riegling, especially in Canada. And the photos themselves that I was able to take are not particularly great. Sepia was a choice. Yet what these opportunities did was that they inspired me to bring my camera out to more shows, and I was able to make some very important connections early on with other photographers and to get some great advice from them on what to do, what not to do. I also learned early on that being at the show with whatever gear I had was ultimately the most important thing and the most important step to getting better. Whether it was reaching out to artists or buying a ticket to a local show and showing up with my camera, it is so unbelievably vital that you are actually making an effort to go out to shows. The thing that I had to remember was maintaining my confidence in my own abilities, because walking into these venues, even smaller venues or music festivals, I have a single camera and a single mid-range lens, which did okay. And it was pretty disheartening to see other photographers with their A7R5s and their Canon R6 Mark IIs and their $3,000 24-70 lenses. But again, it was so important that I was just present and I was trying my best, because ultimately my budget wouldn't allow it and I had very limited camera gear. So I just worked with what I had. One more thing though, with just being there and making connections, the best skill that you can have, and the thing that I found, was that you can take the greatest photos ever made. I mean, you can be a top tier photographer, your skills can be impeccable, but if you're not able to be friendly and talk with other photographers and talk with the artists and have a conversation, be an overall friendly person, then you're not going to succeed. Being cocky or silent, no matter how good you are, which was not the case for me because I was not very good, so I had to make up for it in other ways, it won't lead to anything productive. I've been very lucky this year. I've been at the right place at the right time multiple times, and making connections and talking to these people is just as important as taking the photos. Granted, I am nowhere near a professional, and this is solely just anecdotal after my first year, but I think it's important nonetheless. With gear and lenses specifically, I mentioned that I only had one camera body and the kit lens, the 18-55 and the X-S20. 26 megapixel camera, and has the opportunity and capability, to shoot 6.2K open gate. I have put this camera through the ringer over the past year, and it has consistently delivered great results. Ergonomically, I have needed to add the small rig cage to it for the extra grip and support because I've got big hands. So one thing to keep in mind with the X-S20 specifically, you may need to add that cage just for the extra grip. While I had used the 18-55 at the beginning, primarily because I didn't really have any other options, and so I relied heavily upon renting for the past year for most of my photography. Now, to give the 18-55 kit lens some credit, it's not a terrible lens. I would argue that for most situations and for the average person, 18-55 is a great focal range. I believe that's about 24 to 70 roughly. And the lens is fantastic. It's very sturdy and it does everything that you need to, especially if you're shooting in broad daylight. The issue with this lens specifically is with regards to low light situations. Most concert venues when you're starting out, especially in my case, are very dimly lit, and it is very hard to get anything at f4. You're basically having to crank your ISO up to about 10,000, which, although not unusable, is not exactly ideal. At 18 millimeters and up to 23, the f2.8 is fantastic. You can still work with that lens. That is definitely serviceable. But at the top end, when you're trying to get 55 millimeters, you're just not going to be able to get anything useful in low light situations. If it's an outdoor show in an outdoor venue, the 18-55 works wonders. But for low light situations that you'll often find yourself in, and that I've found myself in, it just fundamentally will not work. The key thing with the Fujifilm lenses is that they don't have a significantly large lens lineup. I believe it's 23 or 24 lenses total. Given that limitation, and short of using the 16-55 f2.8 or the 50-140 f2.8, primes are really your only option. On one hand, the image quality coming from these prime lenses is top-notch. However, the prime lenses present an interesting dilemma specifically for concert photography, just due to the flexibility in the types of shots that you can take. When you're only using one camera body and you only have one or two lenses, you're not exactly able to change very quickly on the fly. And this presents a really big problem, especially when you're at a festival or a bigger show where you can only get the first 3 songs for the band and you are in the pit with other photographers. This year, I often found myself switching between the 23mm f1.4 and the 90mm f2 while I was in the pit in under 9 or 10 minutes for the first 3 songs, and with other photographers around me, sometimes having to do that in the rain, which I would not recommend ever. It's a very bad idea. Don't ever do that. Not only does it take up more time having to switch lenses when you only have 3 songs, but it is immensely limiting in the variety of shots that you can get. Due to the nature of concert photography changing so often, artists are always doing different things on stage, something could be happening in the crowd. You can't really react with prime lenses the same way that you can with a zoom. If you see an artist about to jump in the air and you want to catch them in motion, you have a zoom lens. Let's say that you're at 16 millimeters on the low end of your lens and you know that you need to get into 55 really quickly, you can do that. With a prime lens, if you have a 23 millimeter on your camera, you can't zoom in. You just have to shoot with 23, and that is severely limiting for concert photography. Despite these limitations, however, and I understand that this is a bit contradictory, I found that I was able to adapt fairly well, and a majority of the shots that I took with the 90mm f2 and the 23mm 1.4 are very sharp, very clean, and they produce some amazing images. If I were to recommend a setup for a Fujifilm concert photographer, I would almost certainly pair the 16-55 f2.8 with a 90mm f2, covering a focal range of 24mm to 135mm if I did that math correctly. This will allow you to get some fantastic wide shots at 16 to 23mm, while also being able to get those tight shots of an artist's face, or even if you want to get some shots of the drummer, which you should do, but not many people do. In a perfect world with two camera bodies, I would highly recommend one having the 16-55 f2.8 and the other having the 50-140, which I believe would be an equivalent of 24mm up until 200mm. This way you're getting the f2.8 aperture all the way through, and you don't have to worry about missing shots. You're gonna be able to get pretty much everything you need to at a concert venue. If you were in a smaller space, or you only wanted to focus on prime lenses and needed to focus on the low light, the three lenses that I would recommend are the 23mm 1.4, the 56mm 1.2, the weather resistant, and the 90mm f2. In cases where you just want to use primes or you need the low light specifically, that is 100% what I would recommend. And I'll be there in a heart. So on the topic of film simulations and RAW versus JPEG, this is something that is highly contentious, I think, with Fujifilm users and Fujifilm fans. Fujifilm cameras are known for their stunning film simulations, and the JPEGs that come out of these cameras are spectacular. If you've properly exposed your scene, you are likely going to come away with a fantastic image in the color profile that you'd like, such as classic negative or classic chrome or Astia. While film simulations are fantastic, they don't allow you for much flexibility when you're only shooting in JPEG. The flexibility in RAW images is almost a necessity for concert photography. You need to be able to correct your image if you overexpose or underexposed, and with a JPEG, you can still do that, but not to the same degree. Not only this, but if you're working with other photographers or teams, you will need to send your RAW files over to them for them to edit. And if you're working for a festival team or anything like that, you will likely not be the one editing your images. You will be taking them, but the edits will be up to somebody else. Using a JPEG for that and using film simulations will not allow for that flexibility. You need to shoot RAW. I would also recommend shooting RAWs just to take the time to learn how to edit and to develop your own style and your own flexibility. I certainly have not perfected my style and how I want my images to look, but I have a fairly good idea of what kind of vibe I want to go for, if that makes sense. What helps Fujifilm users specifically is that each editing software, such as Lightroom, has color profiles built in that can allow you to apply those same film simulations to your images, even though it's not a JPEG. Now, they're not exactly the same as those created by Fujifilm. They are replicas. They still give you the general profile of what you'd be shooting on if you were to shoot a JPEG. While not for everybody, Fujifilm film simulations may help your photos to stand out amongst Canon and Sony shooters who might have to work a little bit harder to get that same look that they want, as opposed to you just having that built into your camera. Autofocus, burst speeds, and overheating. Right out of the gate, everyone knows that Fujifilm has subpar autofocus, and that shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anybody who has used the system before. I would say that this is not nearly as bad as what most people on the internet will tell you, but it does struggle significantly in certain scenarios. If you are in a scenario with flickering lights or in a scenario that is dimly lit, I would argue that based on my experience, Fujifilm is going to struggle. Even in lighting situations where you have dark blues or reds or even greens, you may find that autofocus struggles a lot, both in photo and video. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is predominantly with continuous autofocus. Single point autofocus, typically quite accurate, and I would highly recommend that any concert shooter has single point autofocus on. On the other hand, continuous autofocus is essentially unusable. Unless you are shooting with manual focus, single point is really the only option for you. With this in mind, I have found that as time goes by, I've gotten more used to the limitations of the Fujifilm system, and I know when it's going to cause me problems. With video, the autofocus is noticeably distracting and inaccurate. This is not to say that it's poor all of the time. In situations like right now, I'm using autofocus, but granted, I haven't moved around a lot. If I were to start jumping between shots, then maybe it's going to struggle to keep up. And this is the one sore point for videographers specifically. This is especially noticeable when you're trying to film multiple subjects on a stage or as parts of a band who are moving around consistently. It can't quite keep up. And while this can be a creative tool that you can use, if you're going for pinpoint accuracy, the Fujifilm cameras will struggle. Now, with recent autofocus updates, this may change and it may improve, but based on over a year of shooting, it has been noticeably distracting. As for overheating, I have only run into a few situations where I was using the camera so substantially that it turned off due to overheating. Most of the time this happens when using a burst mode or when recording for a long period of time. The first section of this video, I was recording for about 25 minutes straight. It does happen, but if you're taking breaks between shooting, if you're not running your camera for the entirety of a 20, 25 minute, 30 minute period, you're going to be just fine. Get up to human nature. Early on, I was encouraged to look into purchasing a higher end Sony or Canon camera if I was serious about concert photography. And I don't think that that's necessarily the wrong take. If you are serious about concert photography and you want to make sure that your shots are always going to hit, I would highly suggest looking into a Sony or a Canon camera. Fundamentally, concert photography relies upon hitting focus, and as many shots just simply cannot be replicated, you need to make sure that it's accurate. With this in mind, I have intentionally stuck with Fujifilm cameras because I just have more fun and I think they're more creative tools to use. I've had so many photographers reach out to me after seeing some of my photos, asking what I shoot on and being surprised and shocked that it came out of a Fujifilm camera. While there are certainly drawbacks such as unreliable autofocus and lack of available lenses, I do think that the challenge of using Fujifilm cameras in a way has a major payoff when you realize how rich the photos are and how much personality they have. I certainly don't think that my photos are breaking ground or innovating in any way. I think they're okay and I think I do all right, but I do believe that they provide a warmth and a personality to photos that isn't quite matched by other brands. Once more, I'm not a professional, I am a hobbyist, and I got into this because it's fun and I like it, and I've had some very cool opportunities because of it. And despite the temptation to switch to Sony or Canon to have a more accurate tool, I want it to be fun. Photography should be fun, and that's why I do it, and Fujifilm helps me to achieve that. With this said, I hope that this has been interesting. I hope it's been informative in some capacity, and you've learned a little bit about using Fujifilm cameras for concert photography. I've included a few of my favorite images in the video that I've taken with mostly the X-S20, but recently a bit on the X-H2S as well. And again, I've had quite a lot of fun with that. I've had quite a lot of fun with these cameras. If you are at all interested in checking out more of my photos and concert photos specifically, please head to deadair.ca/portfolio, where you can find all of my photos and all of my images from this year. And also take a peek at Instagram at deadairlive to find my most recent work, which may not have made its way to my website just yet. I've had some incredible opportunities this year, from shooting some of my favorite Canadian bands such as Pup and Tokyo Police Club and Dizzy, to having the maybe honor of a lifetime meeting Simple Plan, doing their media, working with them, and doing photos for that band. Phenomenal, and that's all just within my first year. So I'm very excited to see what happens in year 2.